Psychology of people who prefer silence. There is a specific kind of tension that fills a room when someone refuses to speak. A heavy, almost magnetic pull that forces everyone else to work harder, to talk faster, to fill the void that the silent person has deliberately left open. And it is in this void that we find one of the most misunderstood and powerful psychological profiles in human behavior. We live in a world that equates noise with presence, assuming that if you have something to say, you will say it. And if you are quiet, it must mean you are empty, shy, or perhaps even judging those around you. But this assumption is a fundamental error in decoding human nature, because for the people who genuinely prefer silence, the absence of speech is not an absence of thought, but rather an abundance of it. Have you ever sat across from someone who looked at you with a calmness that made you feel slightly exposed, as if they were reading the subtext of your behavior while you were busy worrying about the surface level of the conversation? Or perhaps you are that person, the one who sits in a chaotic group dinner feeling perfectly content to listen, watching the social dynamics play out like a chessboard, wondering why everyone else feels such a desperate need to broadcast every fleeting thought that crosses their mind. To understand the psychology of people who prefer silence, we must first dismantle the idea that silence is passive. Because biologically and neurologically, the quiet brain is often the most active room in the house, humming with a level of processing power that requires a withdrawal from the external noise to function at its peak capacity. When we look at the cognitive architecture of someone who prefers silence, we are often looking at an individual with a unique baseline for cortical arousal, a concept in personality psychology suggesting that introverted or quiet individuals possess a naturally high level of internal stimulation, meaning they do not need to hunt for dopamine in the external world because their internal landscape is already rich, vivid, and sometimes overwhelming. While the extrovert is starved for stimulation and seeks it through chatter, social, friction, and volume, the silent individual is trying to manage the flood of data they are already receiving, processing microexpressions, tone shifts, and environmental details that the loud person completely misses in their rush to be heard. This is why the silence of these individuals often feels loud to others. It is an active silence, a silence of observation rather than vacancy. And this observation stems from a deep-seated psychological need for accuracy over speed. In a conversation, most people listen with the intent to reply, their brains revving up the next sentence before the other person has finished speaking. But the person who prefers silence listens with the intent to understand, engaging in what psychologists call deep processing, where information is not just heard, but integrated, analyzed, and cross-referenced with past patterns before a response is even considered. This creates a delay, a pause, that socially anxious people find terrifying, but that the silent person finds necessary. And it is in this pause that they hold their power, because by the time they do speak, their words have been filtered through a rigorous internal quality control system, giving them a weight and gravity that the constant talker can never achieve. However, there's a deeper, more complex layer to this preference for silence that goes beyond simple introversion or high sensitivity, a layer rooted in the mechanics of emotional survival and the development of what is known as hyper-independence or counter-dependency. For many who prefer silence, keeping their thoughts to themselves is not just a personality quirk, but a learned defense mechanism, a psychological armor forged in environments where speaking up was either useless, dangerous, or met with indifference. If we trace the developmental history of the deeply silent individual, we often find a child who learned early on that their needs would not be met by asking, or that revealing their true inner state led to vulnerability that could be exploited, and so they retreated into the one fortress that could not be breached: their own mind. This is where silence transforms from a preference into a survival strategy, a way of maintaining control in a world that feels chaotic or unsafe. And this manifests in adulthood as a person who solves their own problems, manages their own emotions, and rarely asks for help, viewing words as unnecessary leaks of vital energy. This counter-dependent silence is fascinating because it presents a paradox. The person appears stoic and unbreakable, yet this wall of silence is often protecting a core of intense sensitivity, shielding a soft underbelly from the potential rejection or misunderstanding of the outside world. They do not speak because they have learned that people rarely listen well enough to deserve the truth, and so they hoard their thoughts like gold, sharing them only with the very few who have proven capable of handling the weight of their authenticity. This brings us to the third and perhaps most intriguing psychological angle: the relationship between silence and emotional regulation. Specifically, how quiet people use silence as a tool to maintain what is called ego-syntonic stability. In a social environment that thrives on emotional contagion, where one person gets angry and suddenly everyone is shouting, the person who prefers silence acts as a psychological anchor, refusing to participate in the escalation of chaos. This is often misinterpreted by partners or friends as coldness, detachment, or a lack of caring. But in reality, it is a high-level form of emotional discipline, a refusal to let the external storm disrupt their internal weather. By remaining silent, they are preserving their autonomy, creating a boundary that says, I will not be dragged into a reaction that does not belong to me. This ability to sit with discomfort, to let a question hang in the air without rushing to answer it, to let an insult land without immediately firing back, signifies a mastery over the ego that is rare in modern society. It is the realization that the immediate reaction is almost always a conditioned response, a reflex born of insecurity, whereas the delayed response, or the choice of no response at all, is an act of true volition. The silent person forces the world to slow down to their pace, and in doing so, they often inadvertently trigger the insecurities of those around them. Because in the face of a blank canvas, people tend to project their own anxieties, assuming the silent person is judging them, when, in fact, the silent person is often just thinking about something entirely unrelated or simply enjoying the peace of existing without performing. Ultimately, the preference for silence is a rejection of the social performance that consumes so much of our daily lives, a refusal to engage in the phatic communion, the small talk and social noises we make just to reassure each other that we are harmless, and instead, a commitment to only speaking when the words improve upon the silence. For those who love a silent person, this can be frustrating until it is understood that their love is not expressed in the quantity of words, but in the quality of their presence, in the fact that they are there at all, observing you, knowing you, and choosing to remain with you in the quiet. And for those of you who see yourself in this description, who have felt the pressure to come out of your shell or speak up more, it is crucial to recognize that your silence is not a defect to be fixed, but a function to be understood, a necessary filter for a mind that sees and feels more than the world often gives it credit for. You are the keepers of the pause, the observers of the details, and in a world that is shouting to be heard, you are the only ones who are truly listening.